G'day, how are you going? Thank you for tuning into Extra Healthy-ish, the big sister podcast to Healthy-ish. Both podcasts are from Body and Soul, and yes, I am your host, Felicity Harley. Now, grief. It's something we all have to deal with at some point in our lives. We'll all respond differently. We'll move on differently. Well, therapist and author of a new book, Embracing Change, Jana Firestone, well, she has her own experiences with grief, but also she's worked with many people going through horrendous trauma surrounding grief. She's going to share her tips on not only how she pulled through, but how you can too. Jana, thank you so much for coming on Extra Healthy-ish. Now, you are just about to give birth, so your answer to this question might change if I asked you in 6 months, but how are you staying extra healthy-ish right now?
Well, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I'd have a much more interesting answer. I'd be doing Pilates and going for lots of walks, but at 36 weeks, I'm waddling, I'm lying down as much as I can, I'm in the pool as much as I can be, and trying to do a little bit of self-care. That's about all I can manage at the moment.
Oh, I like it. That sounds enough self-care for me, though. Yeah. Now, well, congratulations on your new book, and it's about embracing change and going through grief. And you've got I actually really liked your story. I found it empowering, your journey through your own grief. Can you tell us a bit about what happened with your mum?
Yeah, when I was 21, my mum died suddenly, just out of the blue with no warning. And we all had to kind of scramble to come to terms with that and make sense of it. But her death came at a time when we'd already had several losses in the family, and we had several more that came after that. So the entire top generation of my family disappeared, all probably within a year or two. Leaving my dad as the oldest person in our extended family. And it was, incredibly shocking and difficult, and something that changed me absolutely as a person and as a professional, and changed every kind of facet of my life. And, I think it helped me in many ways, which as weird as that sounds, because it did give me a different perspective on life and helped me to connect with people in a very different way.
And just going back to that time, how did you come out of it and push through your grief? I mean, this is what drove you to become a therapist. Talk to us about this period.
Yeah, look, I don't think it was necessarily a conscious choice in the sense that I was like, oh, I'm going through grief, I know what I'll do with that, I'll become a therapist. However, it is exactly what happened. And I had always, Mum was a psychologist and Dad's a psychiatrist, and I'd always thought, one day I would end up in that field too. But I thought it was in the very far off distance of 30 back then when I was 21. And so I suppose there were two things going on. There was one, the grief that you're dealing with day in, day out, all night. It just is so consuming. But at the same time, you're able to kind of walk around and look like you're a normal person participating in life. And that part of me that was in autopilot and looking like I was a living human being at the time, I think that part of me decided, okay, it's time to kind of get your things together and start doing something else. And so that's why I enrolled in psychology and sort of just decided to see where it would take me. And so I don't know that I was consciously saying to myself, I can do something with this grief and I can turn it into something good. But I think that's just where it ended up.
So as a therapist, you went on to work in the coroner's court. What did you learn from your patients about grief? And what did they perhaps teach you that you didn't realize or work out for yourself when you're going through your own grief?
I mean, when I think about my days at the coroner's court, which is a lot, I think about all of those beautiful people that I worked with so frequently, because I worked with them in the absolute worst moments of their lives, having lost someone suddenly and unexpectedly. And it was everything from losing children to partners to siblings to friends, parents.
And often in quite traumatic circumstances.
Absolutely. From the most horrific circumstances you can think of to sometimes something that's just happened at home, but there wasn't anyone to, know what happened at the time. So it's not only the trauma that they're dealing with, but the unbearable grief of losing someone they loved in unthinkable circumstances. And I think what I learned from them is that, the absolute worst possible scenario can happen. It can really happen, but you can be okay. Their strength and their courage was beyond belief. The families I worked with after the Black Saturday bushfires showed resilience that I couldn't even write about. You couldn't imagine. And I don't know whether they'd say that they felt resilient moving through all of that trauma, but it's like living through horror. And they showed me that you can do that. You can find a way, find a moment of hope and find a moment of lightness and just keep putting one foot in front of the other.
We'll be back after this short break with more from Jana. How did you process your grief? Is that similar to what you went through?
Yes, I think to a lesser degree. There wasn't trauma around my mum's death, except for the loss itself being so huge. But I think I was very much processing my own loss at the same time that I was helping other people process theirs. It was still only a few years after I'd lost mum, just over a few years that I was working there. And I think while it gave me the perspective and the connection, I think, to do good work with people, because I really understood what they were feeling.
Absolutely.
I think it did help me process it, because I could see all the different ways that people were dealing with grief. And they're so completely unique. Every single person dealt with it differently. There was no script that I was using for every single client that walked in the door. It was completely unique and different with every single person that walked in. And there were hundreds by the end of that time. So I think their experiences helped me to work through my own grief too.
And you say, in terms of grief, that closure is a myth. Why is it a myth?
I just believe that we don't ever close the door on our grief. I think our grief is constantly evolving and it changes as we do. So I may not be crying myself to sleep every night anymore, but there are times when I absolutely want to burst into tears. And the things that I think about now, being a mother and not having my mum here to enjoy all of that with me, that's the stuff that causes me grief now. Whereas back then, the grief was all about my immediate loss and my person being gone. So I don't think that it is possible to close that door on grief and to reach a point where you're suddenly like, oh, okay, I'm done with this now. I'm good. I've done my grieving, I've done my work, and I've moved on. I think it just grows and evolves, and you sort of get used to it in a way, like that uncomfortable friend. Yeah.
And how do you deal with it now when you have those moments where, you wish your mum was there when you're about to give birth to your third child?
Yeah, well, I talk about it, and I think that helps. I think it helps to kind of say it out loud. Sometimes you need to have a little moment and have a cry. They don't last that long anymore, those moments where in the beginning of a loss you can, experience that for a really long time. And I just like to kind of think that she's here and seeing some of what's going on. My kids talk about her as if she's here, and you know, it's a nice sort of way of keeping her alive. So I try and keep her memory a living, real thing, and I think that helps.
Yeah. Where do you think the closure myth has come from? Why have we got to this stage where we just, well, I suppose we never forget someone, but you'll be all right. You just deal with it. Let's move on.
Yeah, I think there's been a little bit of unhelpful sort of pop psychology that's come into, you know, the general population, and we always tend to kind of cling onto words, you know, that like at the moment where everything's woke or everything's, you know, there's some theme that's cancelled. That's right. And I think closure was one of those things for a while. And I think probably we all wish there was closure. It would be amazing if you could work 10 steps and then be done and feel amazing and back on your feet and not affected by grief anymore. But unfortunately, it just doesn't work like that. And I just think it's not fair to sell that myth to people when they've lost someone, because it's unattainable. And I think that'll only then cause more grief when they don't reach that end point.
Absolutely. More grief down the track. So if closure is a myth, how can people get through their grief? I mean, whatever stage they're at, and embrace change rather than just getting stuck in their grief?
Well, I think it's important just not to focus on just what you've lost, but to try and think about all of the things that you had. And I know that's so hard because losing someone you love feels completely unfair and like you've been robbed of so many things. So it can be hard to then try to see the light in it and try to see the positive. It does take time. And, you know, some people really amazed me with how quickly they were able to just focus on the positives and how lucky they were to have that person for as long as they did. But I think finding ways to find the positives and to give yourself the space to grieve and not feel like you're under pressure to get anywhere with it. You know, if you're having a bad day, have that bad day, cry, feel miserable, let it all out, have the day on the couch. And then the next day you try for something different.
I love that. Have you read that book by Lee Sales? Is it Any Ordinary Day? And I think her one message in that book, which I took away from it, and I don't know if any listeners have I'm sure many listeners have read it, not if any listeners have read it. And she says is just, embrace the moment. I think it's something like the ordinary is actually the extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful message, and it's so easy to overlook the ordinary, but just getting through one day is a huge feat and should be celebrated. If you have 1 hour where you're not crying or not feeling absolutely desperately low, that's amazing, and you should celebrate that. Be proud of yourself and find those little wins to help you kind of put one foot in front of the other, and know that everything does change. Everything will move on. You know, today is a bad day, but tomorrow could be better, and you just have to keep shooting for tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there anything after you've written a book, often you can, and now you're talking about it, you can look back and think, oh, I didn't realize that? Or is there anything that you now look back and think, oh, wow, that is really true? Or
I actually had a few moments like that, because, you know, you do become quite reflective of your own life, and I was putting pieces together that I hadn't necessarily put together through the, pathway of my life before. So it was interesting for me, thinking about my grief and putting all the pieces together with a relationship that ended at the same time or shortly after, and what happened to my friendships at that time and as a result. And so that was really interesting for me to kind of see my life from a macro perspective. It's so easy to get caught up in the micro and focus on one thing or whatever's going wrong in that moment in your life. But it was really cathartic, I suppose, to take a step back and see how all of these different elements of my life have played together.
Well, Jana, thank you so much for coming on Extra Healthy-ish, and good luck with the next part of your life.
Thank you so much. It's a change I have to embrace.
I hope you like this chat with Jana about grief, knowing how you can sit with your grief, feel your emotions, and ultimately get through. If you want more from Jana, her book is called Embracing Change. She goes quite deep into grief, so it's worth looking at that one. If you want more from us, remember Extra Healthy-ish. We publish a new episode for your wonderfully healthy ears every morning, Monday to Thursday. For more info, head to bodyandsoul.com.au or join the conversation via Instagram or Facebook. Thanks again for listening to this chat with Jana, and if you have a moment, we'd be so grateful if you could rate, review and subscribe to this podcast. And until tomorrow, stay extra healthy-ish.